judges decided the way they did, where we go from here, and just what the decision means for the country's electoral system. I have a team of lawyers and election experts in studio tonight to discuss exactly that. But first, my colleague Sophia Wanuna, who has been on this case since it was filed. Sophia is right now in Karen, the nerve center, where the legal fireworks happened behind the scenes before they went to court. Sophia, please explain to us, just recapping to our viewers who may not have captured the gist of what happened today. The judges saying President Uhuru Kenyatta wasn't validly elected for that second term on August 8th. What would you say was the main reason why the 6 judges, or shall I say the 4 judges, made that call?
Indeed, Joe, it was that ruling that was anticipated. The whole country, all eyes were at the Supreme Court earlier this morning. And when the judges walked in, tense moments they were. Fingers were crossed, everybody waiting on the pronouncement, on the judgment of the judges. And of course, it was on 4 areas that they considered this morning. Was the election conducted in accordance with the Constitution? Were there irregularities? And number 3, if there were irregularities, did they impact on the final result? And of course, the orders of the judges. And it would be seen from a lot of the lawyers who've been speaking to that audit and scrutiny that was conducted. And of course, this was following an application by the petitioner. It was conducted under the supervision of the Supreme Court. Officials from the court had a significant bearing because it revealed a lot of those discrepancies. Earlier, we had heard from one of the lawyers for the petitioner, Otiende Omolo, bring out some of the discrepancies, and other lawyers as well. But this one, ordered by the court, been overseen by the court, the final report having been written as well by the court officials, therefore, Joe, indicating there was no bias. You know, all the parties were present to comment on what was going on, and then that final report and word from the official, that definitely appears to have tilted, I beg your pardon, the scales of justice to the favor of Raila Odinga and Kalonzo Musyoka, who are the petitioners in this particular case, Joe.
A very, very dramatic turn of events there, Sophia. Obviously, you've been speaking to some of those lawyers throughout this period on both sides of the divide, the legal divide, as it were, in this case. Did you get the sense that they were expecting this by this morning, or was it a total shock for everybody?
I will tell you this, Joe. Lawyers and supporters of the president, Jubilee, were very optimistic that this petition would be withdrawn, or rather rejected, would be kicked out. So it was rather interesting to see and witness as we were watching all this, and the judges were reading out their decisions. Jaw-dropping, I would say, for some of those who really did not see it going this way. It was unthinkable, unfathomable for most of those supporters. But for the Raila supporters, NASA supporters, it was elation. Immediately the judges pronounced themselves. We started hearing celebrations. Remember, the Supreme Court, there was a barricade all around the perimeter, but there were supporters gathered outside that barricade, and it was instantaneous, as far as the screams, the shouts, the celebration, which we've witnessed throughout the day. So really, but I also think largely there was a lot of confidence even for the NASA supporters, the petitioners' supporters, that after that final report, those reports I was talking about earlier, they really gave a boost of confidence, because the questions, they say, were glaring. It would have been absurd, some argued, to see the judges rule against them. However, for the Jubilee, many are the different arguments that they made. And the main argument we kept hearing today from the lawyers is that pattern, that how is it the president still has the majority. We had the president as well talk about it earlier today, even during the Supreme Court submissions by their counsels. Remember the young lady, the lawyer as well, submitting on that pattern, that they had been able to succeed, and that therefore it would be impossible, or it would be unimaginable to annul the election of the president and leave that of the other positions where they felt, or rather fared rather well, looking at the maps that they displayed. So, Joe, what a day. Mixed feelings for most, but a big and significant day definitely for Kenya and for our history books.
Sophia, many people say this is the height of irony, because if you think about it, NASA wasn't quite intending to go to court. At least that's what they told us initially. As a matter of fact, there is a certain famous Tuesday that we were all waiting for, and going to the Supreme Court was just the last thing that any Kenyan would have imagined was going to be their option, because they had categorically sort of ruled it out. But from your conversations with them, what convinced them to actually go to the Supreme Court? What is this thing they had that they thought, well, maybe this is something that we can present before the judges?
It was the numerous pressure, Joe, across the board, because, yes, as you said, at the beginning, NASA had indicated they no way were intending to move to court. But it became clear with time that not going to court any other way, eventually momentum would be lost. And you saw those deaths as well that were being reported with a crackdown on the various protests that were witnessed. So first it was a question of, do you allow loss of life? And how do you justify that? Because there is a procedure in law. Our laws require that if you have a dispute when it comes to election, it's very clear. So it becomes difficult, and it would have been difficult for them to later explain, even to their own supporters, that not going to court, what is this other avenue, and who gets to decide you're right or wrong in the other avenue that you choose to undertake. So I guess for NASA, after deciding at the time they would not move to court, and on further consultations and also appeals from across the board, including the international community that they have criticized and castigated a part of it today, especially speaking observers, it became evident that really not going to the Supreme Court, Joe, would have been a huge mistake. And I guess today they do not regret that decision at all.
Now, Sophia, of course, I'll delve deeper into that with my panel here, but just a final question. It fell on the law firm of a gentleman, I think, that you have there, but which not many of us knew before then, Awele and Murumba, if I got it right. Do you have any insights why it wasn't some of the top legal firms that we know in town? I mean, this was a prominent case, presidential petition for good measure. How did we end up there?
How did we end up there? And we want to talk to him. He's here with me, Jackson Awele, as you mentioned there, of Murumba and Awele, and former Prime Minister, NASA leader, I beg your pardon, significantly mentioning him as well earlier during that press conference at Okoa, Kenya. So Awele, many people, and just talking to Joagay in our studios, before all this had never heard of you, and this is, we are hearing you're the one who really kicked off this petition, because initially the NASA leaders were saying they're not going to move to court. Talk to us about the initial stages of this.
Yeah, I mean, yes, the decision had been made. It appeared that the NASA principals were never going to go to court. But then, as a lawyer, you can never take the word of your clients, for the gospel truth. And so, as lawyers who've been working with the NASA the NASA team since before the elections, we somehow still had the confidence that we could convince them, to try out the Supreme Court for whatever it was worth. And I must say that it was not a very easy thing to do. And for the first few days just after the elections, myself and Mr. Paul Mwangi, who was basically the head of operations of the legal team, mulled over, that possibility. And it was a decision that we reached on the day that the IEBC decided to announce or rather declare the president-elect at Bomas. And I remember meeting up with the Prime Minister and Senator Orengo, Professor Ben Sihanya and Mr. Paul Mwangi. And although he did not expressly tell us that this was a position that he was going to take, we looked at, we considered the discussion that we had at the time, and immediately we left the venue. I was instructed by Mr. Paul Mwangi, the head of operations, to sit down and immediately start drafting, a draft petition. And I remember that was a very long night for me because I was equally anxious. So you can imagine the anxiety and having to sit down and compose yourself and start drafting a petition of such complexity. But I did it, and I shared it with the team. That was how we worked. I had to come up with a first draft and share it with the legal team. And still, that draft stayed in people's emails without any comment for another, I think, day or two. And it became very frustrating. We really needed, to get it out there. But we had to get instructions first. And then when eventually the instructions came, and we had all the legal minds now streaming in to join us, they all settled in pretty fast, and to flesh it out now to what it eventually became. And
you began your law firm in January this year, but before you were working with the former lead counsel, the lead counsel in the last petition, Raila Odinga versus IEBC, George Oraro.
Yeah, coincidentally, yes. I worked under senior counsel George Oraro for just about 3 years. I left in January of this year to start my own law firm. Before that, I joined Oraro from the firm of Kaplan and Stratton, where I did my pupillage and also worked for another 2 years. And the reason why I left Kaplan and Stratton to go to Oraro and Company Advocates was so that I could practice litigation. And so for 2.5 years, about 3 years, I worked under senior counsel Oraro, and it is during that time that I got the opportunity to also assist, in the background, though, in the preparation of the 2013 presidential election petition.
Finally, this was your nerve center, and as far as the legal teams, I see very many young people here tonight. And we also heard Raila Odinga talk about the significant role they played in this. Talk to us about these young people out here.
I have to say that these young people are the faceless, unsung heroes of this petition. I cannot, overemphasize the role they played in making this petition a success. I mean, crunching the numbers, pouring through the forms and, the documents, the voluminous documents that we got from our agents across the country, from the IEBC and whatnot. Without these young men and women, I don't think this petition would have been. And I really salute them wherever they are. We as the lawyers are hogging all the limelight, but really, a lawyer's case depends on the evidence that he or she submits in court, and without their evidence, really, this wouldn't have been possible. So I have to say thank you to all of them, wherever they are, for their tremendous effort, in seeing this to fruition.
Many thanks, Jackson. Well, and there you have it, Joe, and quite a number of young people here. It's dark, and unfortunately, this was the only place we could set up because of the connection issue.